Hey, podcast listeners. Today we're going to talk about healthy defenses. So, I view healthy people like a grain of wheat with an outer bran layer that defends the precious germ that is inside. When the right conditions appear, such as good soil with enough moisture, adequate warmth and sunlight, the wheat will naturally shed its outer bran layer, and that germ will start to germinate, sending out its roots. Many of my clients are like grains of wheat, but they lack a strong enough outer bran layer. In other words, they lack a healthy skepticism of other people, otherwise referred to as defenses. They want to believe the best about everyone, and they are too trusting. It's interesting to note that people who lack defenses tend to have hearts that are the most good. It's as if because their hearts are good, they assume that others' hearts are also good. This naivety often creates conditions for them to become a scapegoat to the people in their lives. I help them to develop this healthy brand layer by helping them see the truth about their parents, which is necessary. This doesn't mean their parents are all bad, but their parents are human, so that means there is some bad to them. And we need to recognize this in every one of us, in our parents. Our parents are the original imprints that shape the way we see everyone and everything else. It creates an invisible template in our brain, unbeknownst to us, that shapes how we see everything. If we don't see our parents objectively, our lens will be distorted and we will not be able to develop discernment. Once we recognize the bad parts in our parents, we are then able to see the same patterns elsewhere, which gives us wisdom to distinguish good from bad. This allows us to finally develop that healthy brand layer, protecting that germ inside. We no longer attempt to send out roots into depleted soil because we are able to surrender false hope and to trust and protect ourselves. Although a healthy human heart is like a germ within that wheat, many people are actually nothing like this. Many don't have a germ inside with the potential to germinate and grow, but they're more like oysters with an outer calcified shell and something internal that really lacks integrity. I've had a glimpse inside several oysters in my life, and I've seen firsthand why people at this level of emotional stuntedness need such strong defenses. Their heart is so underdeveloped and needy, they cannot allow themselves to be vulnerable. It's interesting to think that even though I knew my mother for 51 years, I only met her twice. I was mainly acquainted with the mask that she wore. She was always on stage, acting so confident and so emboldened, never able to exit the spotlight and just be herself. Her persona was invincible, and it exhausted her. I only met the real Caroline 2 times. Once was when I was visiting my parents after college, and at that time she was really struggling. She was running again for the school board, and this time there was a strong possibility she wouldn't be reelected. Being on the school board had fed my mom's narcissistic supply like nothing else, and now it was in jeopardy. And she looked to my father for encouragement, but found none. She told me how she had asked him, "What if I'm not reelected?" And he responded with, "Oh, well." She then started crying like a little girl, loudly, bending down her head and leaning her head onto my chest, wanting me to wrap my arms around her and comfort her. I had never seen this part of her before, and it shocked and repulsed me. It was so inconsistent with who she pretended to be. The other time I met the real Caroline was when she was at the end of her life, which is a very common time that adult children first see a real glimpse of their real parent. Over the phone, her voice sounded like a little girl, and she said, "I just want to go home." Mind you, she was living in her home of 4 decades, and my father was caring for her round the clock. I instinctively knew that the child in her wanted to go back to Ohio, where her parents were in her mind. I told her, "Mom, your parents aren't there anymore. They're dead." To which she responded forlornly, "Oh, oh." I met my real father once as well, just a few years ago. His mask is less obvious than my mother's, but it's just as real. He acts cold and callous, disinterested, unless he happens to be the center of attention, and then he is a ham. He will do anything to get that attention. He used to compete with my mom and with me for that attention when other people were around. I distinctly remember him making joke after joke after joke during the wedding reception that I had, which at the time didn't bother me. But now looking back, I see that this was his way of diverting attention from me onto him. I see in hindsight how my presence has always been threatening to him when other people are present, because God forbid he have to share the attention with me. He viewed me as competition. My father also displayed the perfect example of borderline personality disorder, a very, very common trait, which is idealization and devaluation. When a parent idealizes the child for a very short time, usually, to be followed by devaluing them. I have a feeling most of you listeners are going to relate to some of this, so I want to share it with you. So I would go without seeing him for many months, but every time I would return to see him again, he'd have this enormous smile on his face, looking so delighted to see me. I felt so loved for those first few minutes. Each time I would hope it would last, but it never did. It would always wear off in a very, very short time. I'd work so hard to keep it there. I would ask him questions. I'd show so much interest in his life. I would try to be entertaining and tell him about my life, but the joy would always fade. I now see that the idealization of a borderline can't last. It feels too vulnerable for them. So even if nothing bad actually happens, a borderline will find a way to devalue the moment just to feel more in control. They can't allow themselves to feel this level of excitement because their hopes are truly unrealistic. So they clamp down the shell. For the child, even an adult child, it feels like all the warmth has left the room, and they feel alone and desperate for it to return, believing that they can somehow win it back. A child of any age will do whatever it takes to secure that parent's love and approval, betraying themselves in the process. The one time I met the real Mike was just a few years ago. He called me one day with a quiet, desperate voice that I had never heard before. He told me he needed my professional advice, which was my psychological support. And that was the one and only time he had ever even admitted to having a psyche. He told me he hadn't slept at all the night before and he was suffering. He said the depressive period started when he had fallen down and hurt his pelvic bone when caring for my mom. I realized he was probably worried about his future. Here he is being a caregiver for my mom, And who would care for him when it was his turn to be old and decrepit? I told him, Dad, I don't blame you for feeling scared about the future, but please know I will take care of you. Should you need it, Steve and I will come get you. We will put you up in the mother-in-law unit in our house, and we will make sure that you have round-the-clock care. Don't worry. His voice then became like a little boy, hardly a whisper. He said, You're wonderful, Bronwyn. I love you. He said this twice. These were the words I had waited all my life to hear, but somehow they didn't feel right. Not like this. I called him the next day to check on him, and his voice was the same as it had been the day before. He repeated his idealization again. He said, You're wonderful, Bronwyn. I love you. Although it felt good, it still just didn't feel right. I called him maybe 4 days later to check on him again. This time the mask was back in full, maybe even overcompensating for his vulnerable period. I asked him how he was sleeping, and he said, I'm sleeping just fine. I said, Great, so you're no longer worried about your future. He replied, I was never worried about the future. I just hurt my pelvic bone and I couldn't sleep. That was it. I was too stupid at that time to know better. You don't argue with denial. The mask was his choice, exemplified by the hardness of his voice. Vulnerable Mike was once again shielded by his outer shell, and there was no prying it back open. Now, again, we all need some defenses, but what matters isn't that we have defenses, but the degree of their defensiveness. They should not be impenetrable. A bran layer is necessary to shield our tender heart, but an oyster shell is never good. The degree of difference between my father's vulnerable self with his little boy shaky whisper and his calcified outer persona is an example of what we psychotherapists call splitting. Splitting is when we are so disconnected from ourselves that we are highly inconsistent, which is the opposite of whole and integrated. People who have this degree of splitting have very little insight or self-awareness. They are people with the most shame because shame is what causes splitting in the first place. We can have empathy for them, but from afar, because they are not what we would call safe people. The goal of emotional growth is to move toward wholeness and integration, which is to heal and dislodge the shame within us and heal those internal rifts. It's not to be perfect, but rather to come to a place where we are no longer strangers to ourselves, but rather having complete self-awareness and self-acceptance. An integrated person may struggle with jealousy, but they would be able to admit it openly. It's the person who cannot admit their jealousy who is the most dangerous. The last example I want to give of someone who is like this is my former childhood friend who I will call Kendra. Kendra came to visit me during one of my very severe depressive episodes when I had gained a lot of weight and was very lonely. Now, Kendra has never been one to talk about emotions or validate anyone else's. In fact, she usually tries to talk people out of their feelings. This particular time, I had gained 30 pounds from my depression, and I was struggling with jealousy, and I confessed this to her, of another friend of mine who looked so beautiful. Instead of comforting me and validating what I was going through, suddenly Kendra breaks down crying loudly. I was shocked, and I inquired further. Kendra confessed to me that she struggles with jealousy of her sister-in-law, who is naturally thin. Now, in all the years I had known Kendra, which were many, I'd never seen her show this level of vulnerability, and it made no sense to me. She wasn't depressed, and she wasn't overweight. She looked great. But why am I suddenly comforting her for these feelings that apparently have always been there just under the surface? In retrospect, I now see that Kendra, much like my parents, is another oyster. She too wears a perpetual mask of invincibility. But that day I had a peek at what's underneath, a very fragile, insecure, jealous little child. All that time, I'd assumed she had it more together than me, and that I was the weaker one of the two of us because I had all these big emotions. Yet nothing could have been further from the truth. The people who are most able to recognize and talk about their emotions are the stronger people, not the weaker. Even if the Kendras of the world would like us to believe otherwise. We're all human, but some of us have a greater level of acceptance of our humanity than others, which is what makes us strong and what makes us whole. In a past podcast episode, I touched on a principle in physics that is called the observer effect, if you recall. This is when the very act of being seen, and this is a principle in physics, the very act of being seen changes what is being seen. It's often exemplified with light, which is both a wave and a particle. When light is unobserved, it has no shape or integrity, and we call it a wave. It's actually more like a schmear. But something about human observation causes light to coalesce into what we call a particle, as it contains a constitution holding it together. I happen to think this effect also applies to a human heart. A child who is seen develops a strong, intact heart, and a child who goes unseen by their attachment figure produces an underdeveloped, amorphous heart. A strong heart has empathy for self and others, and has a constitution that is able and willing to feel all kinds of feelings. A less developed heart lacks this type of integrity and only has empathy for self. The strong heart needs protection, but not excessively. It does best with an outer bran layer that dissolves when the conditions are right, allowing that heart to germinate and take root. The underdeveloped heart is too weak for this, and so it grows that calcified outer shell, just like an oyster. Most of what you'd find, should you pry it open, is nothingness. And if you attempt to look for a heart, you can easily be pulled in by the gravitational force of the nothingness, like a black hole. Being with such a person reminds me of the famous quote by Gertrude Stein, "There's nothing there. It feels hollow because it is." Humans who don't have empathy for others and who are unwilling to feel their feelings aren't quite human. There's so little substance to them. When humans are made to be substantial creatures, full of life and light. Some people are obviously empty and wearing a mask, but others, like my father and Kendra, will occasionally provide what appears to be a temporary warmth, creating false expectations for those around them who hope and wait for more. It's the inconsistency that makes people like this the most dangerous, as we have false hope in them to be human, to deliver something they can't. Connection and consistency. But once we integrate, giving ourselves that warmth that we are desperately seeking, our eyes are able to open to see the truth about them and finally surrender false hope for them to ever meet our needs. It's amazing how differently we will see things, and it allows us to live in reality. and to surround ourselves only with truly safe people who are fully human. Now, I don't know about you, but I am tired of being around zombies, people who are like the walking dead. I want to be fully alive every precious moment I'm on this earth, and I can no longer afford to entertain people who can't tolerate my aliveness, people who are threatened by authenticity and need me to amputate part of myself in order to be in their presence. This is my life, and I will do whatever it takes to create an oasis of safety and flourishing. Life is for the living, and it is worth the fight. Don't you agree? And won't you join me? Thanks for listening today. Please share this episode with a friend. Please subscribe to this podcast, and please give me a great review. Thank you.